I think exactly. It is a post-traumatic stress disorder. And when something like this happens where there's a missing instrument or there's an implant, it's not the correct implant, it compounds the anxiety that can be produced. And it has a lingering effect because it adds minutes and delay to the next case or the finishing this case. And then that gives an impetus for the team to try and move along the following case to make sure that everything there is present. And so it's very disruptive.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Dr. George Cybulski, Certified Sterile Process and Distribution Technician, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Vested Medical Incorporated. George began his career in the supply chain of operating room as a neurosurgeon. George, in his 30-plus year career, has practiced neurosurgery in academic medical centers as the chairman of neurosurgery in one of the nation's largest public health systems in the VA system and in support of Operation Desert Shield Desert Storm as a U.S. Army neurosurgeon. All of these experiences exposed George to the critical facets of support that sterile instrument process has in the efficiency and quality of surgical procedures. While obtaining an MBA in healthcare management from Loyola University, Chicago in 2008 to 2010, George began focusing on lean process improvement of his surgical instrument trays for his own spine surgery procedures, and naturally to the sterile processing of those instruments and certification in 2019. George joined Vested Medical as a founder and chief medical officer in that same year of 2019 to bring all of these experiences to bear on providing an innovative service at Vested Medical for value-added sterile instrument processing. And Hank, you heard the term lean in Dr. Cybulski's bio introduction. And while this is the first episode as we kick off season 10, it is not going to be the only episode where you hear us reference lean, which will be a focus on our very next episode of the season. But kicking it off is going to be this conversation with Dr. George, as his teammates lovingly refer to him. And I think you'll hear why. Very humble and very engaging individual. And I can't wait to get into his perspectives. We've obviously had our own chief medical officer on Beyond Clean several times, and we have interviewed many other surgeons, but I love getting this perspective, and especially from one that is certified in central sterile services.
That's right, Justin. I'm excited for this conversation as well. And to your point, the interesting perspective from someone who's taken that extra step to get certified in our industry, even though he didn't have to, obviously, but he had a drive to make that decision. We'll talk more about that on the interview. And I hope, come away from this interview with a renewed perspective for sterile processing technicians and managers for how to engage their surgeons and their facilities to also have an interest in our departments.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break with Dr. George Cybulski, Chief Medical Officer with Vested Medical.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Dr. George Cybulski, Chief Medical Officer with Vested Medical. And I know everybody at Vested calls you Dr. George, so we will as well during this interview. And I just want to let you know that I love these episodes that we do with surgeons who have had a chance to really experience sterile processing. And our own chief medical officer, Dr. Peter Nickel, was a guest on this show before he came on board the team. And I can't tell you how important it is to our listening audience that works in sterile processing to hear your perspectives and the fact that you've taken an interest in the industry. So very excited to have you kicking off season 10 with us. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Justin. I really enjoy, and I've enjoyed the work I've done with my colleagues and collaborators in sterile processing. So I'm very, very happy to be here and, of course, to be able to talk about what we're doing with Vested Medical.
All right, so our standard way to start a lot of these interviews is to get a little bit of your background, tell people who you are. So why don't we just real general give us your experience in the surgical services realm, and then we can maybe dive a little bit more specifically into your sterile processing experiences.
All right. Very good. Thank you. So I've been a neurosurgeon. That's been my career. I've been a neurosurgeon for over 30 years. In the process of being a neurosurgeon, I started to really look at the other components which contributed to the flow and to a successful operation. And that took me into the home of sterile processing of our instruments.
And so, Dr. George, as a surgeon back in the day, right, 5-10 years into your experience, can you bring us back to the times in the middle of surgery or perhaps before surgery when there were issues related to instrumentation, before you got exposed to the ins and outs and context of sterile processing? How did you feel in those situations? What stressed you out the most? Can you give us a couple of stories about those experiences?
Yes, thank you, Hank. Really, what I notice in the process of doing an operation is a point that I have called the pregnant pause, which is when we ask for an instrument or we ask for an implant and we get silence because that instrument is not on the table ready for us to use, or the implant is not the right implant that they have on the table.
That pregnant pause is an interesting concept because for sterile processing, we don't hear that. What we hear is the phone call after the pregnant pause.
Yes.
Right? So that experience in the room is interesting because, again, having not been in there at the moment when that realization is made, everything that comes after that, that domino or the waterfall effect, from that prompts the phone calls or prompts the red-faced rep who just ran down, 2 flights of stairs into the apartment. So what happens, or what did happen after those pauses in your workflow?
Well, as you just said, I call it the pregnant pause for a reason, and that is people just stop and try to cope or somehow figure out why something is missing, or is it not here, or who's responsible for it not being there. And then, yes, a mad exercise occurs where there's like hitting a panic button. And if it's an implant that's not there, the rep is feverishly looking in the trays that are opened on the field. The charge nurse is interacting with either the surgical tech or the scrub nurse, and they're having a discussion. And so we go from like a quiet moment to just a ramp up in anxiety, and then calls downstairs, usually downstairs to the central sterile processing department to say, oh, do you have another laminectomy tray, or do you have another craniotomy tray? And just this mad exercise begins. And the flow, obviously, whatever rate it was occurring at in the operation, comes to a halt.
So, Dr. George, one of the things Hank just said was that pregnant pause isn't something that the team members in sterile processing experience. They experience all of that anxiety that comes next. But what does that mean for the patient? Because also the team members in sterile processing are not as connected to the patient as is everybody in that surgical suite. Can you talk about the things that are going on in your mind as you know that case is being delayed, and the considerations and concerns for the patient that are running through your mind while you're waiting for resolution to the issue?
Well, yes, first and foremost, it's a well-established relationship that the longer a person is under an anesthetic, a general anesthetic, and the longer a wound is open, the risk of infection increases, or the longer a person is under an anesthetic, the greater the chances of a complication due to a prolonged anesthetic occur. So that's what we're thinking about. And of course, we are scrubbed into the operation. There's nothing we can do to help find something, find the missing implant or find a missing instrument. And so there's this disconnect that is really creating anxiety throughout the operating team as well as our collaborators down in Central Sterile Processing.
So you're talking about an environment that when things are going well, everybody's going along, and then when an event like this happens, the stress starts to kick up. What does that mean culturally? Not necessarily in sterile processing, although I think culturally the entire surgical services is impacted by this, but culturally in the operating room, the fear of that happening again, or based on every time that happens, the way that it creates this anxiety. What does that sort of tee up, especially when things aren't running right? I can see how if those events are happening more and more often, it's almost like there's a post-traumatic stress disorder kind of thing that would happen for people who work in the OR, because obviously everybody cares greatly about the outcome for the patient.
Yes, I think exactly. It is a post-traumatic stress disorder. And when something like this happens where there's a missing instrument or there's an implant, it's not the correct implant, it compounds the anxiety that can be produced. And it has a lingering effect because it adds minutes and delay to the next case or the finishing this case. And then that gives an impetus for the team to try and, move along the following case and to make sure that everything there is present. And so it's very disruptive.
Let's talk a little bit, Dr. George, about how you moved from that experience of the instrument process in the operating room to your interest in sterile processing. And I guess maybe my first question would be, as a surgeon, when was the first time that you can remember ever going into a sterile processing department? Did you do that in your first 10, 20 years as a surgeon, or is that something that came later?
I'd say probably starting about midway in my career. And it was motivated by just a general curiosity as to, what is going on with the process to get our instrument trays ready. And then also my interaction with the medical device reps and, what their job involved and how they got our implant trays present and accounted for procedures. And so maybe 10, 15 years ago, I went to Central Sterile Processing and introduced myself. And of course, the supervisor knew me by name because back in those days, our trays had our names on them. Dr. Cybulski laminectomy tray, for example, and introduced myself. And I told her that I was interested in what goes on down there. And she remarked that this was one of her first encounters in her career where a surgeon actually came with an open mind to see what the process was and didn't come down there screaming and yelling because something was missing from one of their trays.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking as you were telling that story. As a sterile processing manager, you do get to know your surgeons, at least by name. Definitely as a frontline technician, you don't have the opportunity as often to meet your surgeons or see your surgeons. But when they show up in your department, on the rare occasions that they do, it's almost never for a good reason or for a neutral exploration of the department, shall we say. It's almost always coming down because there has been a major problem to the point of the circulator couldn't handle it. The rep couldn't handle it. It's had to be something that the surgeon, took the initiative to stop in the middle of their day, come down, find the department, find the manager, and have a conversation. And so, yeah, to your point, the fact that you decided to go down, makes you one of those chosen few in all of surgery, who have taken that proactive step to go down and actually see the process and get to know the people. So in that experience since then, right? So we're talking 10, 15 years ago. Obviously, you have continued your interest in progressing and understanding how sterile processing works, what makes it tick, how to improve it. In that time since, what has prompted you or encouraged you to continue this exploration?
So I achieved two things from that initial inquiry. And one was the supervisor said, well, why don't we get you in the proper, protective equipment here? And why don't we take your tray that you just finished your laminectomy with? And why don't you go through it with the technician to decontaminate it, prep and pack it, and sterilize it? That led me further down this path, and I said, this is really very interesting. Now I understand more about how complex it is to get these instruments processed and then to get them together for another operation. And I said, and what I'd like to do is with your technicians is I'd like to come and show them, I'll bring a spine model, for example, for a laminectomy, and we'll take one of my trays and we'll go through it with them and show them why we need a Lexel rangeur, for example, or why we need 4 carousons of 1, 2, 3, and 4 millimeter foot plates. And so that created this relationship so that, of course, again, the technicians, they knew my name from processing my trays, but now they knew my face, and I could explain to them why we needed 4 carousons in the laminectomy tray.
Yeah, that's great because you build a bridge, right? Not only is it an attempt at mutual understanding, but it's mutual learning. So all the things that you didn't know about sterile processing, you're getting while you're there. And at the same time, everything that they don't understand about surgery because they're not there, you're sharing with them. And that really, I think it's powerful for team dynamics more than anything. And when we talk about team dynamics, one of the biggest things is when there isn't that understanding, I think it leads to a lot of inefficiency because the priorities aren't necessarily aligned. And that really kind of brings me to surgical workflows in general and what you see not only in your work as a surgeon, but in your work today with Vested Medical. What are the inefficiencies that you see continue to exist currently in that SPD to surgery workflow?
Well, yes, by them understanding why we need certain critical instruments and my understanding how they process them, I took this relationship that we built further. And for example, for a lumbar microdiscectomy, where I use about 10 of the instruments for doing the actual operation, we would have 6 trays of instruments, including 1 tray with 30 hemostats on it. And so we worked together to eliminate the redundancy. And by eliminating that redundancy, we improved getting rid of instruments that we didn't use. We would only use about 10% of the total instruments. We would be able to pare down the trays. That would decrease the processing time. And it would also have indirect benefits in that if you take out 30 hemostats because your incision is only 1.5 inches long, people aren't going to get, repetitive stress injuries from lifting these heavy trays.
Yeah, that topic of overstuffed trays is true not only for hospital-owned trays, but obviously also for the vendor-managed trays as well. And that's one of the reasons I know a lot of our listeners will know this. The AAMI standards have even had to put a maximum weight for these trays because the sheer metal mass involved in the redundancy or in the waste, as you said, the inefficiencies in these trays. We've had to max it out just on the basis of the ergonomics. These trays have become too heavy to lift and twist and turn, not to say that our sterilizers, couldn't penetrate that amount of metal, but the fact is that it's not because they have to be that large. There's just processes that have fed into these trays growing over time, over potentially multiple surgeons using the same tray and instruments getting added and added and added, but no one ever stopping to ask, hey, do we still use these other 5 hemostats that are always being processed, always being sent to my room, always being sent back to decontam, but does anyone ever use them? So Dr. George, thinking then from the surgeon to surgeon perspective. If you had a surgeon, sitting here with us maybe on this interview, and they're asking from the context of these inefficiencies, or even from the context of your previous comments about getting to know sterile processing in the process, what would you communicate to them about sterile processing that you've learned over the last couple of decades that you wish every other surgeon understood in the industry?
Well, first off, I would want to convey that the professionals that help us have the instruments we need to do the surgery are a critical part of our team, and that we should get to know them, just like we know the nurse anesthetist or the anesthesiologist or the scrub nurse, etc. Really, they're an integral part. Obviously, we could not do the surgery without them. So I would emphasize that first and foremost.
Yeah, even to your point about coming down and providing in-services, I know looking back at my department in-services, some of the best experiences that my technicians have had have been that surgeon putting the face finally to the name of those trays and being able to ask questions, just as you said, what is this used for, and why do you have this, and why is your tray perhaps different and the other surgeon's tray in the same service line? And just being able to get that education and insight gives you so much more critical thinking firepower, so that when those pregnant pauses happen in the operating room and you get the phone calls, you understand more of the context. It's not just, we're missing this one rongeur, that's the 1 millimeter. Now the technician knows what you're using that for, and perhaps even where in the surgery process you are when you're going to be using that particular device. And all of those puzzle pieces start getting connected. And it starts again with the surgeon being willing and able to share that knowledge, and for the sterile processing team, to open the doors as well and invite those folks in to provide that education. And I know it's hard with the schedules and with the timing and all that stuff. Don't get me wrong on that. Don't want to presume that everyone can just break for 30 minutes on a Wednesday to come down and in-service. But there's just a tremendous amount of value there, I think, as you expressed. I don't want to miss a point here. It's in the title of the episode even, but you have gotten your certification in sterile processing. So it's not just that you've gotten exposure and that you have continued to explore and familiarize yourself with the sterile processing industry, but you've taken that additional step to get credentials. What was the reason behind that particular decision?
Well, first off, I love surgery, and the instruments are obviously an integral part of surgery. Once I started learning more about central sterile processing, it just made me have an interest in learning more and more. And so fortunately, the supervisor that I was working with at the hospital that I did majority of my work, she, was very encouraging and said, here's the book, take a look at it. You're a neurosurgeon, so you could probably, she was jokingly saying, you could probably handle, going through the course to get your certification. And then Eric Hartloff, who is one of my partners at Vested Medical, at that time, he and I became friends and did projects together because he was the operating room supply chain manager. So it kind of became a natural that both Eric Hartloff and I would go ahead and get our certification basically in preparation to help found Vested Medical and take our passion for improving the workflow via analyzing the processing steps to this natural conclusion.
This has been a phenomenal interview, Dr. George. Honestly, I can't think of a better way to kick off season 10. And I have just one more question. So, we just talked a lot about, what you would say surgeon to surgeon and how to provide value to sterile processing and how passionate you are for surgery in general and all aspects from a comprehensive level, and your openness to learn from supply and distribution as well as the team in sterile processing. So getting a big picture understanding is really important. And I would say I've not thought about this very much, but inviting a surgeon to come and in service, I don't know how often that happens, but it's definitely something I'm going to suggest. And I'd ask you also, as we kind of wrap up, what are some other maybe ideas or recommendations for leaders, supervisors, managers, directors in sterile processing to engage the surgeon leadership in their facilities to have those kinds of constructive conversations that you've had throughout your career?
Well, thank you. I think it's really thinking about what we've been talking about for the last half hour or so here, and really looking at a customer. Who is your customer? And really trying to understand what are the needs of your customer. And in central sterile processing, the customer is the patient ultimately. And so we have to provide for that patient zero defects in terms of infection control. And in Vested Medical, our mission, if you will, is to provide zero defects in terms of the instruments and implants that are available for orthopedic, knee and hip, and eventually for spine procedures. So I think it's really identifying people as a leader who you feel have the ability to grasp that essential critical component of central sterile processing. And I'm happy to say that one of my chief residents, who I worked with for almost 7 years, he is fascinated with what I've been doing with Vested Medical. And he happens to be a guy who's another learner, and he's getting a advanced degree in artificial intelligence. We're going to combine his and his team's work with what we're doing at Vested Medical to continue to improve the workflow for the operating room.
Yeah, that is so important. And we've had some conversations in the past on this show about the benefits of all kinds of technology, artificial intelligence. We've talked about utilizing augmented reality. And I believe the interview about augmented reality was with Pavel de Sternberg Stoyalovsky, Hank. And there's also even assisted intelligence. And there's such an opportunity for this, especially where we know that the margin for error is just so small. And we talked about at the very beginning, Dr. George, about that culture and how repeated errors and case delays and trying to catch up, but also staying true to that Hippocratic oath and doing no harm, how much pressure that is. So anything that we can do to create those efficiencies and smooth it out and invest in sterile processing for the benefit of all of surgical services, I think is just so critical. And I want to thank you for coming on this episode to share your insights and your thoughts for the future of surgical services from a perspective of the team members that are working in sterile processing.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to speak with pioneers, and thanks for your inspiration as well.
That was Dr. George Cybulski, Chief Medical Officer with Vested Medical. And Hank, I know we talked about this during the interview, and I guess maybe even as we were getting started, about how much we enjoy having surgeons on the show talking about their perspective. But I know we touched on a number of elements that have not come up in other podcast discussions, and specifically around the culture in the OR and how it's impacted by these case delays, that pregnant pause, as Dr. George mentioned before, the anxiety. And, I was asking him around this almost post-traumatic stress disorder, like once this happens over and over and over, and it just creates so much stress, you're going to see people behave in different ways. And it just goes back to how important it is for us to continue pushing this industry forward, creating efficiencies, reducing errors, more safe, not only procedures and instruments, but just safe cultural environments for these procedures to take place in. And I like how he closed this interview and talked about artificial intelligence and all the things that come with that can help drive the industry forward. I'm really excited to see what he's going to do in that arena.
It does come back to culture, Justin, and that's, as we talked about in servicing a sterile processing team as a surgeon, there's a particular culture even involved in that from the surgeon's standpoint, and I alluded to it, right? We know that those guys are busy, we know that they're highly paid, they got a lot of people competing for their attention, and taking that proactive step to come downstairs or to find that sterile processing department, especially when it's not for a negative reason, but to come down and invest in the people who will lead to a smooth workflow and a safe patient experience. I truly hope that we've got surgeons who are going to listen to this episode and take that away and hopefully prompt them, if they've never been in a sterile processing department before, to go down, be brave, and have a conversation. And if you're a sterile processing manager who wants to get your surgeons involved, this is a perfect episode. Put it in your email, forward it to your surgical team, to your surgeons, and say, hey guys, if you didn't know, there's a sterile processing podcast out here that exists. It's called Beyond Clean, and they just had a surgeon on that I think you're going to appreciate this interview, and then see if that is the spur they need to bring them out of the operating room and down to your sterile processing department.
Yeah, and I loved what we were talking about in terms of Dr. George was saying he had in-service sterile processing. Never even occurred to me to go to a surgeon and ask them to in-service. A lot of recommendations out there in the industry to ask them to come and take a tour, but that's not necessarily always a purposeful request. I think reaching out and asking them to educate your team might actually get more results. And I'm somebody who was on the vendor side for many years. I've believed greatly in vendor education and bringing that to the departments because they're starved for education. But I think this could be a really excellent trend in the industry if it took off. Find a surgeon that is going to take an interest, engage them, and ask them to in-service your team. That will absolutely bridge the gap that exists between sterile processing and surgical services. I have no doubts. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to us here at the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.